Let's talk about some of the major glands, endocrine glands, and the hormones associated with them. And what they sort of do. So we'll just make it like a chart here. And we're not going to obviously learn them all. We're going to learn some of the major ones and some of the ones that are more commonly dealt with. Just a survey of the few. Okay. Let's talk about first the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus. Okay, we had an issue with recording, I think. Okay, so I'm not sure how much of this we actually recorded because of some glitches. So I'm just going to recap. We're talking about the major endocrine glands and hormones. We mentioned the hypothalamus, which is a part of the brain and serves as the integrator. We're going to talk more about the hypothalamus a bit later in detail. And then we move down here and we're about to discuss the pituitary gland and what some of the things that it does. But there's a reference in your textbook on page 473 that has a picture of a human body, and it shows where all of these glands are located, right? So the pituitary gland is right up there beside the hypothalamus in the brain. And the hypothalamus and pituitary often work together. All right, so what are some things that the pituitary gland does? Let's pick some various sort of options here. The pituitary has probably about 8 or 9 important hormones that it secretes. We'll look at some of them. Let's see, oxytocin. Oxytocin. Does anybody know what oxytocin does? It's uterine contraction during birth. And it also stimulates mammary glands to begin milk production. So oxytocin is an important one during pregnancy, obviously. Sometimes if they want to induce a pregnancy, or a delivery, I should say, they want to make the delivery happen sooner because for some reason it's not progressing the way it should. They can induce labor, and they often do that by injecting oxytocin because that stimulates the uterus to begin its contractions. Here's an interesting one we'll talk about because it's called antidiuretic hormone. And since we were talking about the kidney, remember what a diuretic is. It's a drug that changes the permeability of the collecting duct, which causes the filtrate inside to retain water, right? And that means that your urine becomes very sort of watery. What this does is the opposite. It promotes the retention of water. Antidiuretic. D-I-U-R-E-T. Sorry, what? Yep, these are all in the pituitary gland. Promotes retention of water in the kidneys. So the opposite. Instead of making your pee watery, it brings that water back into the system, right? It retains the water rather than letting it go in the filtrate in the urine. So it's an antidiuretic hormone. Let's see. Growth hormone is an important one in the pituitary. Growth hormone has been identified as stimulating, obviously, growth, especially in bones and things like that. So, excuse me, stimulates growth. If you don't have growth hormone, you will not actually grow very well. Growth hormone if it's not in the appropriate amounts, can produce situations where, we get improper growth. So growth hormone is often, doctors will often check kids out to make sure that they're meeting certain benchmarks as they're growing. Like they should have a certain height on average by a certain date, a certain weight. And they're always looking at these benchmarks. And if they don't meet them, one of the issues might be a problem with the pituitary producing growth hormone. Prolactin is another one. Prolactin, the word lact gives you an idea. It stimulates milk production and secretion. In mammary glands again. So it's closely related to the oxytocin in its role there. The oxytocin stimulates the development of mammary glands and gets them sort of started on their process. And then the prolactin actually stimulates milk secretion. Prolactin. There are some others. We're not going to get into all the details of them. We used to do reproduction in grade 9 biology fairly extensively, and we dealt with a lot of the hormones involved in regulating reproduction. There's the follicle stimulating hormone, which produces the production of sperm and eggs in the ovaries and testes. Luteinizing hormone, which again is involved in stimulating ovaries and things. Thyroid stimulating hormone, though, that's a good one to do. Your thyroid is another gland, and so the thyroid stimulating hormone is a hormone released by the pituitary, which then activates or influences the thyroid. Thyroid stimulating hormone. A lot of these hormones have little shortcuts, right? Because they're all so big. So oxytocin doesn't. Antidiuretic hormone, though, where are we, is sometimes called ADH for short. So maybe I'll put those in red underneath here. ADH. Growth hormone is sometimes called GH for short. Growth hormone, it's pretty straightforward. Prolactin, PRL, but prolactin is short enough that most people just call it prolactin. Follicle stimulating, we didn't do. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. Thyroid stimulating hormone. So you'll often see them referred to as these capital letter shortcuts. Oxytocin, not really. It doesn't really have, it's a one word. If it's a one word, we usually don't worry about the shortcuts, right? It's usually when it's 2 or 3 words together, we just give it an acronym. What were we doing here? Stimulating hormone, sorry, not S on there. And of course, what it does is it stimulates the thyroid gland. And then whenever we use the word stimulate, what we mean is that it sort of interacts with it. It secretes a hormone that, when moved through the body, gets to the thyroid gland and then causes a thyroid gland to do something. So stimulates the thyroid. And we'll talk about what the thyroid does a little bit later. Let's see. Okay, I think that's all that we'll do for the pituitary gland. So that's probably lots. There's a few others, but we don't want to go crazy. So now let's talk about the thyroid, since we brought it up. I'll go thicker here. We'll draw a nice line. We'll talk about the thyroid gland. The thyroid is located sort of in the neck area. If you look at that picture, in your textbook, you'll find the thyroid down in our throat. The thyroid gland relies on iodine. Iodine is a very important nutrient that the thyroid gland needs in small amounts. And if you don't have this iodine, it can affect the way your thyroid works. You may know people who have had issues with their thyroid. It's a very common place for cancers to develop. But it's also fairly easily treated. one of the nice things about glands is now that we understand how they work, we can often remove them from the body and then supplement with whatever hormone they would produce. It's not perfect, obviously, because the body is constantly monitoring and adjusting all the levels, whereas that's hard to do with pills. But we can do that. We can take the thyroid gland out if it becomes diseased, but and then supplement with medications. So what does the thyroid gland do? It does a couple of main things. We're not going to do the... all right, let's do it this way. There's two sort of big words here. So you're going to ask me how to spell them. So it's triiodothyronine. Triiodothyronine, which is sometimes just called T4. Or sorry, T3. Triiodo. T3. And there's another one that's called thyroxine. So I'm going to put these together. And thyroxine. It's pretty easy to identify which gland these come from because they have the thyroid in them. They have thyroxine and thyronine. So it's actually not as hard as it sounds. They both work in stimulating different metabolic processes. Several different metabolic processes. A metabolic process, remember, is either the breaking down of a particular molecule, like glucose, for instance, into pyruvate, or a building up process where you're constructing something, like taking carbon dioxide and fixing it as a bigger molecule of glucose. So those were two examples of metabolic processes, and there are literally thousands of metabolic processes that are happening in our bodies doing different things. These guys are among the two hormones that regulate those. And then there's one other one I'm going to put on here. That's calcitonin. And I'm choosing the ones whose names pretty much describe what they do. So it's easier for you to remember them. What calcitonin does is it lowers calcium in the blood. It lowers calcium, blood calcium level, let's put it that way. In your bloodstream, there's calcium. So it actually promotes the absorption of calcium by bones, lowers blood calcium levels. Essentially, the calcium is a very important ion in your system. It's very important for, we think of it for bones and teeth, but it's also critically important for muscle action. And if you have too much or too little, things go wrong. So the homeostatic process is to make sure you have just the right amount. So there's a constant play where if your blood calcium level drops too low, then your bones will basically start to dissolve a little bit, and the calcium will go into the bloodstream to be utilized. But if it gets too high, you have too much, it'll then reform new bone. So it's a constant back and forth. So this hormone is the one that lowers the blood calcium levels. Do you have a question, Bree? Yep, these are all hormones. Okay, so that's it for the thyroid gland. We'll draw a line. Then right around the thyroid is what's called the parathyroid gland. The parathyroid, I should do that in my thicker, each gland I'm trying to do in the thick letters here. Parathyroid, which basically just means around the thyroid. So it's named for its position. And it secretes parathyroid hormone. That's a pretty easy one to remember. Parathyroid hormone, which is sometimes called PTH. Parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium levels. So we're going to use this one as an example later. Raises blood calcium levels. When we talk about regulation, we'll use blood calcium as our example, and we'll see how these two glands are working together to maintain a homeostatic level of blood calcium. One making it lower, one making it higher. All right, there's the parathyroid. Okay, so a question was brought up considering you have these two hormones that are working in sort of partnership, one to raise and one to lower calcium. The question was brought up, do all hormones work that way? And the answer is not necessarily. Although it is common for two hormones to do opposite things, sometimes you have situations where you don't need a hormone to increase the level of something. And the next example of that, the next hormone we do is a good example. We'll talk about the pancreas next. Now, the pancreas is often thought of as an organ in the digestive system because it does produce a bicarbonate solution that's secreted into the duodenum, right at the beginning of the small intestine, so that it can neutralize stomach acid. You might remember that from grade 11. But it also secretes another very important hormone called insulin, and that's what we're going to discuss. Okay, so the pancreas secretes insulin. Insulin. And of course, insulin is a regulator of blood sugar level. So what insulin technically does is it lowers the blood glucose level. It does that by binding to cells. So here's the example I was going to mention. The raising of blood sugar is usually a result of eating something. You've eaten a meal, your blood sugar is going up because it's being absorbed. There's no hormone that's needed to raise that up. So what happens when you eat is that you have suddenly more blood sugar. And of course, we got to do something with that blood sugar so it doesn't get too high. And what we want to do is we want to bring that sugar, that glucose, we want to bring it to cells and have it metabolized by the mitochondria through respiration, right? We want to break it down into pyruvate and send it into the mitochondria and have it go through the Krebs cycle and so on. And so the way you get it into cells is you need to signal the cells. You need to signal them by changing the structure of their membrane slightly to open up channels that will let the glucose in. Glucose is too big of a molecule to diffuse through, and it's also fairly polar, so it won't go through a membrane on its own. So insulin is released by the pancreas in response to the rising blood sugar levels. The insulin floods through your body, and whenever it lands on receptors of cells, it alters the membrane and allows for the transport of glucose into the membrane, so that now the glucose is in the cells. Without the insulin, the glucose would not get into the cells. That's why we need it, to change the cells, what the cell can allow through. So the insulin is sort of an uptake regulator. It allows the uptake of glucose into cells to be metabolized and broken down. Of course, if it's leaving the blood and going into the cells, it would lower the blood glucose level. So insulin lowers the blood glucose level. And that could be released without any other partner to sort of, I guess what I'm saying is that there's not a hormone that's working against it at this point. But there is a hormone that can raise blood glucose levels. So there's another hormone that's also secreted by the pancreas. It's called glucagon. And glucagon can raise blood glucose levels. However, it does it in a different way. It doesn't raise the glucose levels by stimulating making you to eat more. It stimulates the breakdown of starches that are stored, or fats that are stored in the body, glycogen and fat molecules. It stimulates the breakdown of those by the liver. So when glucagon goes to the liver, it tells the liver, hey, we need to start breaking down fats and things. And glucagon can also activate fat cells to start burning that fat. So, and that would essentially make more glucose available to the bloodstream. So it raises blood glucose levels in that sense. So the two, they seem to do opposite things, but they're kind of responding to different stimuli, right? One is basically when you eat food, the insulin is produced, and then the glucagon is sort of like, well, if you weren't eating and you weren't intaking glucose into your system, then you'd have to get your blood sugar up somehow, and you'd have to rely on your storage of fats and starches, and you'd have to break them down. So those two are kind of important. So the pancreas is very important in keeping your blood sugar regulated. And of course, if you have an issue with your pancreas and it doesn't produce these hormones, you end up with a condition called diabetes, which means that your blood sugar is not regulated very well, and it can go too high or too low. If it goes too high or too low, your blood sugar will cause very serious side effects if it's too high or too low. Typically, you can begin to get weird dizziness. You start to feel a little bit funny. You can go into a sort of a I'm going to say a coma eventually, but before that, you might pass out, you might get a little weak, you might have all kinds of issues. You go into a coma, and eventually you could probably die. So if you don't keep your blood sugar within that homeostatic limit, yep. Let's go down to the adrenal glands, which are located just above the kidney. Adrenal glands, and you may have heard of adrenaline. Okay, adrenaline is sort of an older word. We don't use that word anymore to describe this hormone. The hormones are called epinephrine and norepinephrine that are released here. Now, there are two parts to this gland. I'm not going to get into that. There's the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. So the gland actually has two separate structures within it, and each structure is responsible for some different hormones. The medulla is where we find the epinephrine and norepinephrine, but to keep it simple, epinephrine, and another one called norepinephrine. Epinephrine. These two hormones do work in conjunction with each other, and they are a very important part of the fight or flight reaction, which we'll study later when we get into the nervous system. Epinephrine, when it's released, epinephrine used to be called adrenaline. So when you're getting an adrenaline rush, it means that you're pumping out this epinephrine from the adrenal glands. And this serves to pump the body up. In other words, to prepare the body for the fight or flight reaction. It does things like constricting blood vessels in the extremities, raising heart rate and breathing rates and things like that. Shunting blood flow into the core. All of these feelings of getting pumped up, and when you're scared, it's Halloween coming up, somebody jump scares you, that instant feeling of butterflies in your stomach is the result of adrenaline or epinephrine, which is causing blood vessels to constrict in your extremities and causing a sort of a conservation of blood, that where the blood flow is staying in the core, giving you that weird stomach feeling. Norepinephrine does the opposite. It relaxes those constricted blood vessels, and it brings you sort of back to calm after it's all over. So we'll talk a little bit more about those. Let's just put down together. Let's put down the change glucose levels. I'm writing that kind of small, sorry. Change glucose levels, increase metabolic activity, and we'll say they can constrict blood vessels. Let's put that down. Constrict blood vessels. Uh, the adrenal gland also secretes two other hormones, which we're not going to discuss. They are glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. And these are steroids that also regulate glucose levels in the blood. But they're a little different from the insulin and the glucagon. The insulin and the glucagon are primarily concerned with digestion and regulating the intake of food and making sure that the glucose is either being stored as fat or burned or whatever. So they're more in response to food being taken in by the body or starvation, no food taken in. Whereas the other regulators of blood sugar in the adrenal glands are more because of, again, fight or flight. We need glucose immediately if you're going to have to fight a lion to the death because we need energy. So these hormones are more responding to stresses, and they would kick into action to increase blood glucose levels in order to obtain immediate energy needs.